Hello everyone, today we're speaking about the Italian Navy's contribution to the Second World War, and for this we have our naval expert Drachinifel here.
Hello.
And be sure to check out his channel if you don't know him already. And so basically, the Italians are generally very underappreciated during the Second World War in their performance, but most people look mainly at land warfare. So, and since Drachinifel is the naval expert, what, in your opinion, were the main contributions of the Regia Marina to the Axis during the Second World War, and in what types? Like I was thinking combat, supply, fleet and being, and probably others. But what is your take on this?
Okay, so yeah, that's fairly good way of splitting them up. So the single, if you're looking at things from, I guess, from a strategic and a tactical perspective, from a strategic perspective, the single biggest contribution that the Regia Marina makes to the Axis is that it locks a significant portion, and at times a majority portion, of the Royal Navy into the Mediterranean, which is not a theatre they wanted to be operating in, and it's not a theatre that they particularly want to be operating in, generally speaking. There is obviously a lot of threat from the Kriegsmarine, the U-boats specifically, but also, especially in the early part of the war, from surface raiders of varying sizes. And the Royal Navy would very much like to have as many ships, both escorts and cruisers and battleships and carriers, available in the North Sea and the Atlantic to deal with that. But after the fall of France and the joining of Italy into the war, they can't do that because they have to guard the Mediterranean as well. And then once Japan gets into the war, the British have this lovely pre-war plan that involves surging a good chunk of the fleet out to the Far East to support the war effort there. And to a certain extent, with Graf Spee and Bismarck sunk and Scharnhorst and Gneisenau almost perpetually in and out of dockyard, and obviously Blucher gone down in the Norwegian campaign, the Kriegsmarine, although they've still got Tirpitz and the Scharnhorst occasionally popping up, and Admiral Scheer and Lutzow, that threat could be contained by a relatively small proportion of the overall Royal Navy, which would then allow them to deploy a significant number of forces to the Far East. Again, except for the fact that the Regia Marina is sitting there in the Mediterranean being hostile, and so what comes of that particular plan turns out to be initially Prince of Wales and Repulse, which ends very badly very quickly, and then subsequently you have Somerville's Far Eastern fleet operating in the Indian Ocean for a while, but that is Warspite, a handful of the old R-class, and a carrier or two, and that's nothing like enough to face off against the Imperial Japanese Navy. So simply by existing and being hostile, and therefore drawing in large numbers of Royal Navy resources, the Regia Marina probably ensures that significantly more ships get sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic, and also means that the Royal Navy is not in a position to actually stand up and challenge any part of the Imperial Japanese Navy in any particular regard after the collapse of ABDA Command until pretty much mid to late 1944, when the British Pacific Fleet shows up again. Which both of those aspects, securing the Atlantic and pushing back against the Japanese, are keystones of British pre-war plans, and the Regia Marine just threw both of those down the drain. As I say, simply by existing, and that's before we get into the actual operations that they did carry out. So there's that overall strategic picture, and then the other strategic picture, of course, is that they're sitting slap bang on the Mediterranean, which means all the trade that the British need that could circumvent having to go around the entirety of continental Africa now either has to do that or has to sneak through in fast, heavily guarded convoys that will still suffer losses. So purely from an overall strategic perspective, there's a huge amount of resource that the Royal Navy's forced to commit that they really need elsewhere, due to the Regia Marina's actions. And obviously that's not even getting into the land campaign in North Africa. So if we look at the land campaign itself, the Italian Navy obviously has its own supply convoys that it has to escort to the North African coast. the British obviously would dearly like to stop that, and so they're forced to commit even more resources than just bottling up the Italian Navy, and they have to put their ships in considerable amount of harm's way. So they end up running into Italian motor torpedo boats, minefields, air attacks, and obviously that's later aided, as we mentioned in another video, that's aided by Fliegerkorps 10 and the German supplying German-made aircraft to the Italian Air Force, which makes them considerably more deadly. So there's that on the strategic side of things, but then you've also got the tactical side of things, and that is where you can perhaps see the single greatest impact of the Regia Marina in easy to understand terms. And as we may have mentioned in another video, there is this larger question of where exactly do you draw the line, because you've got ships that were destroyed directly by the Regia Marina, by Italian submarines and surface vessels and aircraft associated with those operations. But then you have on top of that numerous additional ships that are destroyed by German aircraft, both directly Luftwaffe aircraft as well as German aircraft that have been given over to the Italians that the Italians wouldn't otherwise have had. And admit they are there in that theatre of operations because the Italians are hostile, because they're allied with Germany, and therefore in some ways you could also, in a lot of ways I think you can also attribute most of those losses to the Italian intervention in World War II, because at the end of the day, if the Italians weren't hostile and the Mediterranean was a relatively peaceful area, the Germans are not going to want to divert those kind of resources to go and randomly fight the Royal Navy in a theatre that has no particular gain for them. They certainly, even when they had to come and bail the Italians out of the Greek campaign, they weren't basing that many aircraft out of Greece or Crete once they took that. So all of those aircraft very likely would have been off either annoying the Royal Navy in the North Sea or more likely have been sent off to fight on the Russian front. So I'd say there's a good argument to be made that pretty much any Allied loss in the Mediterranean could be attributed to the Italians and specifically the Regia Marina being involved and being a threat.
One particular question. I know that the Regia Marina sent some submarines into the Atlantic, and Dönitz was not very happy, and I think they basically mentioned that they were useless. Now, I assume to a certain degree this was also because it was a bit of a different type of operations. But how did the Italian submarines, fare in the Mediterranean?
It depended on the type. Both sides actually had this problem in the Mediterranean, which was a combination of two things, both connected to the fact the Mediterranean is a much smaller environment than the Atlantic. The first thing was that the Mediterranean is, being smaller, much easier to scout with aircraft. You can have a much higher density of aircraft over the Mediterranean waters with World War II technology than you can over the Atlantic.
So there's no air gap, basically. No Atlantic air gap.
Okay. And that means that the kind of submarine you want to have in the Mediterranean is small, and the reason you want it small is because a small submarine is quick diving and much more difficult to spot, whereas a large fleet-type submarine, slower diving, much more vulnerable to being caught on the surface and attacked by aircraft in the first place. And even if it does manage to get underwater, the second part of the problem is that the Mediterranean waters are much clearer and, generally speaking, much calmer than the Atlantic. Both the Mediterranean and the Pacific actually tend to be, not entirely, but generally tend to be almost a binary bodies of water. They're either relatively calm or absolute sort of tempests, and in which case you're not going to be operating aircraft at all. Whereas the Atlantic has a lot more of the, like the North Sea, a lot more of this sort of middle grade, very stormy, very rough weather, but still something you can fly a plane in. And so when you've got aircraft up, when it is nice and calm, a large submarine in relatively clear, calm waters is pretty easy to spot. And so the Mediterranean is one of the areas you actually see active submarine camouflage being undertaken with disruptive patterns and specific shades of paint being used to try and blend in with the rest of the water from the air. And so the Royal Navy, although they have the T-class fleet submarines, they turn out not to be very good in the Mediterranean. So they end up using things like the U-class and the P-class instead. And the Italians have a similar issue in that they have a few very large fleet submarines, which they can use to some extent, but those are the ones that also end up being sent out into the Atlantic, whereas you say they don't do too well. There's a number of reasons for that, part of which is that obviously they're not linked into the big command and control network that the Kriegsmarine has established for directing the U-boats based on their intelligence. But part of it is also just the way the submarines are designed. They're designed for warmer water operations. They don't cope too well with being in very cold Atlantic waters. And unlike the Kriegsmarine, which has been practicing to one degree or another for anti-convoy operations in the Atlantic for a very long time with its submarine arm, the Italians really haven't. So a lot of it is very new to them. And combining those two factors, their larger submarines don't do particularly well in the Atlantic. They don't do too well in the Mediterranean either, for the reasons we just described, but they do have a fairly substantial number of smaller submarines, obviously smaller, what we would classify as actual submarines, plus midget submarines, plus the human man torpedo type submarines that they end up using against Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, for example. And this is actually a particular area of Italian strength. The small craft submarine operations in the Mediterranean is something they're very good at in general, although some of the midget submarines don't work out quite as well as they'd hoped.
So basically, on the special operations side, the Italian Navy is very good, like sinking, I think, in ships in Alexandria.
Yes, yeah, and when they get the some of their more Mediterranean suited regular submarines out and going, they do inflict a number of losses there as well. Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, as you said, yeah, they're the two they managed to sink in Alexandria. The two big warships they manage, but they also have quite an ongoing operation at the other end of the Mediterranean in Gibraltar, where they find an old hulk merchant ship that is close by to Gibraltar, and they actually base a whole squadron of these little manned torpedoes in the hulk. They cut a hole underwater so that they can exit without being seen. And for the entire duration of the Italian involvement in the war, the British are continually confounded by random merchant ships in Gibraltar's harbour just exploding for no reason, and they can't figure out why, because they check the external torpedo nets and no torpedoes come through. They know that no big submarines have come through, because obviously the Gibraltar Straits are one of the easier areas to sanitize for submarines, and they just can't figure it out. They don't go after the warships so much because the military part of the harbour is much more closely guarded, but it's only after the Italians drop out of the war and they point out that, well, actually that ship that you can literally see over there was sending out manned torpedo missions every so often to blow up your merchant shipping. That's the only time when the British actually figure out what was going on.
Sneaky. Did it blow up the ship, or what did the British do?
No, well, once the Italians were out of the war, it didn't matter too much. One of the main things the British were interested in at that point was how much can we learn from this. The British had their own small-scale submersible operations, but a lot of what they did was inspired by the Italians, and they tried to work with what Italian officers and engineers were available in the immediate aftermath of Italy dropping out of the war. And that in part is why when you look at Royal Navy small-scale special ops submarine operations in the early part of the war, there's some of it, but there's not a lot. But then when you look in the latter part of the war, you have the Chariots, the British version of the manned torpedoes, say going up against a few Japanese cruisers. You have the X-craft going against Tirpitz, etc. And a lot of this is, if not directly, it's not copies of, but it's definitely inspired by and influenced by the Italian successes in the Mediterranean. There's two more bits, I think, which is losses and resources devoted. So I've got a partial list, because, to be honest, if we gave a full list, it would and I mean, just the fact to give a full list would take about as long as the rest of the video is taken in total gives you some idea of how much was committed there. But in terms of capital units damaged in the Mediterranean, there was obviously Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, which were technically sunk, but sunk in very shallow water. Nelson was very heavily damaged by a torpedo that it took during one of the Malta resupply convoys. And 3 of the 4 armoured carriers that the British built, the Illustrious, Formidable, and Indomitable, were all heavily damaged by air attack in the Mediterranean environment. The only reason Victorious didn't get an equal plastering is because Victorious didn't operate in the Mediterranean. I think if it had done, it would have taken just as much damage. And then you get into the ships that are actually sunk. Now, obviously, bearing in mind some of these were sunk by German aircraft or U-boats, but that references back to what we were saying earlier about who's ultimately responsible. But in terms of sunk vessels, the battleship Barham is lost. The carriers Eagle and Ark Royal are lost. The Monitor Terror goes down. The heavy cruiser York. And then when you get into light cruisers, there's Manchester, Gloucester, Southampton, Fiji, Spartan, Naiad, Hermione, Bonaventure, Neptune, Penelope, Latona, Galatia, Cairo, Coventry, Calcutta, Abdiel, Manxman, and Welshman. All cruisers, all sunk. And that's followed up by the loss of 65 destroyers and 45 submarines. So there's a total of 135 vessels, Royal Navy warships, and sunk in the Mediterranean. That includes 2 Australian Navy ships, of which the Italians are directly responsible for the loss of 6 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and 37 submarines, which is a total of 58. That is a huge amount of forces.
So they have a really good kill-to-death ratio if we talk in computer game terms.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, the Italian... I don't think the Italian Navy even has that many ships. It certainly doesn't have 135 destroyer and upward class ships available in the Mediterranean. And it's a stunning toll. And if you think about what the Royal Navy could have been using those ships for, even the ones that were just damaged and were put out of action, that's an awful lot of opportunities missed. And I say that's just the losses. The other part that I wanted to cover just briefly is the forces committed. So apart from the ships that are lost, you've also got the ships that were just, they had to be there to deal with the Italians. So
do you have an estimate on the timeline when these losses mostly happened? Because I know that at one point the Luftwaffe shifted a lot of planes into the Mediterranean, and it also bled the Luftwaffe to a certain degree dry. So was this a reaction to this, or happened this early? I think this was in 1943.
Yeah, the losses, the 2 major clusters of losses that the Royal Navy suffers are around a couple of the big convoys into Malta. I mean, that's where Eagle goes down. Barham's related, but not exactly. A lot of the cruisers are hit in that kind of environment. And the other one is Crete. An awful lot of the cruisers that were just listed were either torpedoed, bombed, or otherwise sunk.
So basically an early war.
Yes, yeah. It kind of, there's an ongoing loss of destroyers both to air attack and minefields. The Italian motor torpedo boats kill a couple of fairly big targets as well. But a lot of the heavy damage takes place connected to the Malta convoys and Crete. Certainly, almost all the carriers are involved in operations in and around that environment when they're either lost or damaged, with the exception of Ark Royal, obviously.
Okay, that is important. So basically, this is not from the Luftwaffe bleeding dry in 43 or something. So basically, this is early war.
Yeah, I mean, Fliegerkorps 10 does get stuck in, but one of and does account for some losses sort of mid 43. But one of the major things that always has to be accounted for is that a lot of the air attacks were combined, which is sort of almost doubly confusing when you're trying to track down exactly who's responsible for what, because not only have you got the actual legitimate Luftwaffe, you've got the Italians in their own aircraft, and you have Italians flying Stukas. So when you see a stream of Stukas going down on Illustrious, for example, Is that particular stream a Luftwaffe stream? Is it an Italian stream? Who's responsible? And
is it the Italian Fleet Air Arm or is it the Italian Air
yeah,
Force?
yeah. So it's all a bit of a muchness, and obviously there's also the fact that if one party attacks and then another party attacks, did the first party wear down the defenses or direct them in another direction that made the second attack go through? So yeah, there's that aspect, and as I say, then you've got the aspect of just how many ships are committed, even the ones that aren't badly damaged or sunk, and we haven't even covered cruisers that are damaged or destroyers that are damaged, because that, as I say, that would take forever. But you're looking at Force H and the Mediterranean Fleet in Alexandria primarily, and let's say you take a good snapshot of early 1943. Typically, it's the demands of the Mediterranean are occupying anything between 3 and 6 battleships, between 1 and 3 aircraft carriers, multiple cruiser squadrons, dozens of destroyers, and of course you have the whole submarine campaign going on both sides, and the convoys themselves. So if you think about all those Malta resupply convoys, the ships involved, and a lot of them were fast, high-value merchantmen because they had to be to get in and out quickly enough. So they're sort of the cream of the crop when it comes to the merchant fleet. So if you think about, say, the Far East Fleet situation with Admiral Somerville, what he wouldn't have given to be able to take, he ended up taking Warspite and 4 R-class out with him. What would he have given to be able to take 10 battleships and 3 aircraft carriers out with him, along with sort of 3 or 4 dozen escorts instead of what he had? And similarly with various operations in the Atlantic, whereas you do have surface raiders like Scharnhorst being sort of warned off convoys by the presence of something like HMS Malaya. HMS Malaya can only really do the scaring off part, whereas if they were able to take Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, or Warspite out of the Mediterranean, those much more modernized ships would be not necessarily capable of chasing down the Scharnhorst, but they'd certainly be able to engage them at longer range and perhaps actually damage them rather than just scaring them off. And although the situation with Bismarck is a separate issue because it's a fast ship, they need fast ships to catch it. But still, when you're talking about that kind of environment, would you have to send Prince of Wales and Repulse over on their own? Probably not. If the Mediterranean is peaceful, you don't have to surge those two as an emergency. You can send out a much bigger force, including carriers, which, okay, fair enough. The Royal Navy's not really that prepared for exactly what they end up facing with the Japanese in late 1941, early 1942. But a substantial force could almost certainly contest the landings, and although they might be somewhat mauled, they could certainly do a lot more damage to Japanese efforts if they were able to take even half the ships that they were having to commit to the Mediterranean at this point.
So yeah, basically the Italians drained away a lot of ships or Royal Navy ships from the other theaters, from the Atlantic and the Far East, and those inflicted a certain amount of damage.
Yeah, when you're talking about 135 ships lost, and probably about at some points even up to half the existing strength of the Royal Navy stuck in the Mediterranean, the impact of the Italian contribution to the war cannot be understated from a naval side of things. The Royal Navy could desperately have used those 135 ships still afloat, and yeah, that the whole course of maybe not so much the Battle of the Atlantic, because obviously a lot of these forces are fleet units rather than escorts, but certainly a lot of the stuff around the Arctic convoys, and very definitely what would have happened in the Far East against Japan would be a very, very different story without the Italian involvement.
So I actually might have to revise my video on if the Afrika Corps was worth it now, because yeah, this adds a complete new dimension. And I suspected at one point, because somebody asked me I should cover was Italy worth it as a follow-up to was the Africa War worth it. And I was getting, after our alternate history podcast and everything, I was getting more concerned because the more you know, the more complicated it gets, and this adds a complete new dimension.
Yeah, Yeah, and I mean, obviously, there's a certain amount to be said for the freeing up of German resources. If the Afrika Korps, Liga Corp 10, etc., if they're able to go up against Russia.
I think everyone got now a better understanding of the Italian Navy's contribution to the Axis in the Second World War. And if you have any questions, drop them in the comments down below.
Yep, and I'll be there as well, as much as I can be.
So big thank you here, Drachinifel. Be sure to check out his channel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.